All right, perfect. I think we can get started. Well, good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Also, thank you so much for joining the user group. As of today, we have about 300 people that have signed up for the user group, which has been a really great success. So I'm very excited to be sort of officially kicking this off. So today there's two main purposes for today's session. We'll start off with a fairly high-level overview of just as an introduction as to what Ally does, how it works, what some of the problems are that it's trying to solve. I know some of you on the call have already been introduced to Ally, but there's probably quite a few that haven't yet. So that's what we'll start off with, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some of the upcoming user group activities and some of the things that we'll be organizing that will allow you to participate in some of our activities like UX research, usability testing, and how you can sort of help influence the direction and the future of Ally. So with that, I'll get started. I will share my screen, and hopefully we don't run into any technical issues today. I am doing this from a hotel room in Lisbon, so fingers crossed that that all goes well. Okay, so I think you should now be able to see my screen. Please shout if you don't. Oh, and so if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in chat. Because we have quite a few people joining in, that's probably the best thing to do. We have some people from the Ally team that have also joined the call. They'll be answering those questions as we go along. There should be enough time at the end of the presentation as well to go through some additional questions if you want. All right, perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll start off with a high level introduction of what Ally is, how it works. We'll do a quick we'll do a quick demo as well, and talk a little bit about some of the problems that it tries to solve. So sort of traditionally, when you look at most of the problem, most of the systems and most of the platforms that our instructors and our students have available today and that they use today, the sort of conversation around accessibility is usually limited to how accessible those systems are themselves. But once it gets to the sort of user-generated content or the course content, that tends to be mostly treated as a black box. And ultimately, that's really the content that the students are after, and it's also where the majority of the accessibility problems are today. So that's really where Blackboard Ally kind of comes in. Some of the problems that it's trying to solve, some of the so that it's kind of trying to open up that black box, try to really look at the user-generated content, that course content, and try to make that content more accessible. So the accessibility of course content, digital course content, is actually quite a hot topic, and there's a few different reasons for that, but there's also a few long-standing problems that have existed in this area, and so there's some problems that you as an institution are faced with. There's some problems that the individual instructor is faced with, and then there's some problems that the students are faced with. So in terms of problems that the institution is faced with, first of all, it tends to be extremely difficult for an institution to get really good insight into how they're doing from a course content accessibility point of view, and that's because there's a ton of content out there. There's lots of different people creating content all the time. There's a wide variety in different content types, and so that makes it quite a challenging problem to tackle, and quite challenging to get an idea of how you're doing. That in itself makes a number of other things quite difficult. So it makes it difficult to understand how you're doing. It makes it difficult to understand where the problems are. Makes it difficult to understand how things are evolving. And in many cases, it just makes it difficult to make a case for accessibility at your institution in general. And then most of the institutions that we talk to, they have something along the lines of an alternative media lab or a disability services department where students can put in requests for things to be made available to them in a particular alternative accessible format. And I'm sure there's quite a few of you on the line today that are actively involved in some of these remediation processes. And as you know, this tends to be a very manual process, a very sort of time-consuming and labor-intensive process. So it can take quite a long time for documents to be manually remediated and made available to students, which on the one hand doesn't really can sometimes be frustrating for the student, but on the other hand is is a very sort of time-consuming and expensive process on the institution's end. And then obviously the sort of elephant in the room, I guess, is that there's some legal requirements around the accessibility of course content, which especially in the US ends up with institutions being sued around this, which is unfortunate, which is very expensive. We are seeing a trend worldwide in terms of this type of legislation getting a lot stricter. So there's new legislation underway in the US, for example, and actually as of today, the Section 508 refresh has been finalized. It's due to go into place, I believe, on the 20th of March of next year, and then will be enforced as of the 20th of March in 2018, unless the new administration does anything to prevent it, which seems highly unlikely. And then we're seeing the same story in the UK. There's some new legislation that's in place around this. There's new legislation that's being created in Europe, and so it's a trend that's happening worldwide, and it's part of the reason why it's becoming such a hot topic, because of some of those legal consequences. In terms of problems that the instructors face, we've talked to quite a lot of instructors about this, and there seems to be a very significant awareness issue. There appears to be a lack of awareness in terms of what the instructors expected to be doing with regards to the accessibility of their course content. There appears to be a lack of understanding as to how many students this can actually affect and how it can affect those students. And there's also a perceived lack of guidance on how the instructor can improve the accessibility of their course content. And so many institutions will say to us that, but we already organize training, we already provide documentation on our website on how to create more accessible content. One of the big challenges there is that there tends to be somewhat of a disconnect between the sort of systems that instructors use to create their content, to share their content, and some of these initiatives. And that disconnect kind of gives rise to that sort of lack of awareness and the lack of understanding and that perceived lack of guidance. And then obviously there's some problems that the student is faced with, which is obviously the most important bit. As I said, they usually have to put in requests for things to be made available to them within a particular alternative accessible format. It is very common for this to take at least days to be turned around, in some cases even weeks, which doesn't always work with their course workflow, can cause them to fall behind. So there's some challenges there. One thing that we think is a very critical problem is that this traditional workflow also tends to exclude quite a few students. It excludes students that aren't aware of this workflow. It excludes students that choose not to disclose their disability. And there's actually there's some research out there now that says that there's an increasing number of those students that deliberately choose not to disclose their disability. But then it also excludes students without a recognized disability. And we very strongly believe that there's a lot of things that can be done around the accessibility of content that will ultimately benefit all students. And that's really where accessibility touches on the quality of the materials and the usability of the materials. And we definitely don't want it to be excluded from the picture. And just to give you some examples, for example, if you have a poor quality scan versus a sort of proper digital version of a document, then even as a regular student, it at that point might make it more readable. It might allow you to copy sections from it, to search through it. Same is true for a video with proper captioning. At that point, it allows you to read through it. It can help with understanding what's being said in the video. It can help you watch the video in sort of high noise environments. For example, if you have a quality description with an image, that can actually help all students sort of help better connect the image to its context. And there's a million examples where some of these accessibility guidelines can actually improve quality and usability for everyone. And so that's something that we try to push very hard through the Ally product. Okay, so that's a little bit of background as to what some of those existing problems are that Blackboard Ally is trying to help with. And so the way in which we see Ally is not as a separate platform or a separate system that people have to explicitly go to, but rather as something that very seamlessly and closely integrates into the systems that they already use. So instead of them having to be aware of yet another system and explicitly go to the new system, we actually want to bring our accessibility features into the systems that they already use and use it as a way to increase awareness, increase visibility, and so on. And obviously, the learning management system is a very obvious starting point there. It's an important player with regards to course content. It contains a lot of course content. Students get to it frequently to access their course content. So that is currently what we're entirely focused on. So we're entirely focused on providing that very close and seamless learning management system integration. We are very much committed to providing Ally to as many students as possible. So we will also be making integrations available into we will be making integrations available into all of the major learning management systems, including the non-Blackboard ones. I'm very excited about that. I think it's just the right thing to do. I think, but it also has a few practical benefits. Like if you have a department at your institution that's using a different LMS, which is very common, then you can still take a consolidated approach, do consolidated reporting, and so on. If you work with other institutions as part of a system level, for example, then you can still take a consolidated approach, do some consolidated reporting. So that's why I think there's also some very practical benefits to taking that approach. Going forward, we see a lot of potential for other types of integrations, things like content management systems like Drupal or WordPress, things like content collaboration systems like Box or Google Drive, things like library systems, publisher systems, and so on. And so we see a lot of potential for very useful additional useful Ally integrations. But right now, as of today, and probably for the remainder of 2017, our focus is entirely on providing that very close and seamless learning management system integration. Okay, so a little bit about how it works and what it actually does. And so and we'll do some quick demos in between these things as well. So the way in which it works is, as an instructor, you go into the LMS, you go into your course site, and you add some course content. And all of this uses the native LMS flow. So we very deliberately try to not sort of change or interrupt any of those existing flows, and almost try to be as invisible as possible while still making sure that our features are there whenever they're needed. And so let's start off with just this first part of the demo. And so I'm going to do a demo on top of Learn 9.1. And I'm going to be, just to prevent technical issues, I'm going to be using a clickable prototype, just to be clear about that. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go in as an instructor. I will go into one of the courses that I'm teaching, and then I'm going to add some course content. So for example, let's add some course content into this folder, but this could really be in any of the sort of native LMS tools. And so let's add 2 items. We'll add one item that's already in the course. So let's pick this one. Okay, so this is something that's already there. We'll add this to the folder, and then we'll add another one. So we'll add something new, something that was on my computer. Add this one in, and submit that. Okay, so everything I've done up until now is basically uses the native LMS flows. As you can tell, we didn't really change any of that, so that's all as you'd sort of expect it to be. But now that this content's been added, there's a few things that will automatically do in the background. So what that means that the instructor doesn't have to trigger anything manually. The institution doesn't have to trigger anything manually. This happens in a very automated way. And so the first thing we'll do, so we'll pick up on these new items that were added, and we'll check, first of all, what type of content is this? Is it a PDF? Is it Word? Is it a presentation? Is it an image? Is it audio? Is it video? Is it HTML? Is it something else? Oh, go ahead, Simon. Oh, at what point did I drop out?
About 2 minutes ago, I reckon.
Oh, I'm really sorry for that. What was the last thing you saw? Okay. Okay, perfect. Then I think we saw most of the first part of the demo, so that's fine. Okay, perfect. Thanks for the feedback. So going back to the slides. Okay, so everything I did in the So everything I did in the clickable prototype, adding that content, was basically using those native LMS workflows. We didn't really change any of that. But now that this content's been added, this is the point at which a few things will automatically happen in the background. And so that means that the instructor, yep. Sorry, say that again.
We're looking at the flag and
Yes, that is expected.
okay, I thought we were looking at the actual file, sorry.
Okay. So now that the content's been added, there's a few things that will happen automatically in the background. So the instructor doesn't have to do anything manually. The institution doesn't have to do anything manually. So basically, so it'll first of all check what type of content is it. Is it like a PDF? Is it Word? Is it a presentation? Is it audio? Is it video? Is it HTML? Is it something else? And then depending on the type of content that it is, it'll first of all run it through an automated accessibility checklist, which will check for common accessibility issues within that type of content. And so that can be anything from very high level checks. For example, is this a scan document, down to very detailed checks, for example, contrast checks at the individual character level. And so that accessibility checklist is based on WCAG 2.0 AA, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. For those of you that aren't, that's an international accessibility sort of standard that most of the legislation worldwide is also moving to. It's also what the new Section 508 refresh will be directly referencing. So that's what the checklist is based on. The second thing that will happen in the background is we've also developed a set of machine learning algorithms that will essentially try to extract some of the semantic information that is visually present within the visually present to the eye, but might not necessarily be there in a machine readable way. And what that means, it'll try to do things like identify what the reading order is, where the headings are, what the heading structure is, where paragraphs are, where sort of tables are, where lists are, where math formulas are, and so on. Okay. So this is where we get into the actual user-facing features of Ally, and we'll start off with the student-facing ones. And so, based on that checklist, based on the machine learning algorithms, we will automatically generate a number of more accessible alternatives for the content that was just provided by the instructor. And so, our kind of primary format that we use there is something that we call semantic HTML, where we'll do things like convert the heading structure that we've identified into semantic HTML heading tags. Convert the list that we've identified into semantic HTML lists, convert tables into semantic HTML tables, convert math formulas into MathML. So there's quite a bit there that we do in order to generate that semantic HTML version. Now, just to be very clear, this version doesn't automatically fix all issues. There's certain things that we can't do in an automated way. For example, if there's images inside of the document that don't have an alternative description, then there's not much we can do in order to automatically generate that quality description. But at least we take an approach where we try and do as much as we can in an automated way in order to provide a more accessible alternative as a starting point to the student. So that's where, first of all, that semantic HTML version comes in. That's a version that tends to work quite well with screen readers. It makes it a little bit more navigable, a little bit more readable. Tends to work well on mobile devices as well. And then based on the HTML version, there's a number of other versions that we generate. There's an EPUB version of the content that we generate, an audio version of the content, an electronic braille version of the content. We'll be working very soon. We'll be working on a version specifically for people suffering from dyslexia, using a very special font, makes it easier for them to read. So there's a number of different formats that we automatically generate. And so the running through this process doesn't take very long. So usually within about a minute of the original being added, we'll have run through this process, we'll have run it through the checklist, generated those alternative accessible versions, and then we take all of those and we make them available to the student as well as the instructor within the LMS. And so the approach that we take there is that we never replace the instructor's original. We always keep the instructor's original in place, but every time that the original can be accessed, there'll be a way for the student as well as the instructor to get to those alternative accessible versions. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what that looks like. So let's go back to the prototype. All right. So just to show off the alternative accessible versions, I'll sign in as a student now. I'll go into the same course, and I'll go into the same folder as the example. And I should now be able to see the items that were added by the instructor. And then, as I said, the approach that we take is that we always keep the instructor's original in place, but every time that it can be accessed, we'll provide a way in which they can get to the accessible version. So, for example, through this little context menu that's always present within the context of where the original is. And then when you engage with that, you'll get a list of all of the alternative versions that were generated for that content item. Before we look at some of those alternative versions, let's have a look at the original that I uploaded, which was a fairly deliberately chosen example. It's an untagged PDF, a very common example of something that we find within the LMS. And depending on the institution, we usually see that about 25 to 50% of the content that's inside of an LMS is of this type. And so this is a particularly problematic example. It's got a 2-column layout which doesn't read well on a screen reader. It's got fairly complex heading structure, but it's untagged so that information isn't there. It's fairly long in general. It's got a fair amount of complexity. So there's some figures in there. There's a lot of tables in there. There's a lot of sort of math formulas in there. And as I said, it's fairly long. So this is a good example, and some of us on the call have gone through this process where sort of manually remediating this type of content would actually take a significant amount of time. And so let's have a look at some of the those alternative accessible versions that we've generated. And so as you can see, we've generated an HTML version, audio version, electronic braille, and EPUB. So let's have a look at the HTML version first. So this is what the HTML version looks like. So you'll see that we picked up on that 2-column layout, that we've incorporated that into the conversion, picked up on some of those headings, incorporated those, sort of picked up on the paragraphs, converted those to HTML paragraphs. And as I scroll through this, you'll see some of the complexity come in as well. So there's one of the tables that have been picked up have been converted to a proper HTML table, including table headings. And then as I scroll through this, you'll see some additional things like the math formulas that were converted to MathML. And then as I continue to scroll through this, you'll see that this is fairly long, and you'll see some of that additional complexity come in, some of the lists that it picked up on, and so on. So as you can tell, so this is sort of a more accessible alternative that we try to make available to the student based on that HTML version. We generate an audio version. For that, we use an integration with something called Acapella, and essentially it generates a very natural voice. We also inject some of the semantic pointers into the speech so that they know when they're listening to a heading, for example. And then the electronic braille version is a version that can be run through an electronic embosser. And then the EPUB version, which I'll sort of quickly pop up as well, which is essentially the same content, the same structure as the semantic HTML version. It's just a different tool or a different medium in which you can read the content, and in which you can and a different set of accessibility features that you can use. Okay, so that's the first part of what Ally does. That's the alternative accessible versions for the instructor. So let's move back to the presentation now. Okay, so that's the first part of what it does. The second part of what Ally does is based on the checklist, based on the machine learning algorithms. We also provide a feedback loop back to the instructor, where within the context of the LMS, we'll provide them with some feedback on how accessible their content is, as well as some very detailed guidance on how they can fix some of those identified accessibility issues. And so that has a number of different goals. It has the sort of short-term goal that if the instructor engages with this, they'll improve the accessibility and improve the sort of quality of their original straight away, which will be useful to the student, will allow us to generate higher quality alternative accessible versions. But the real goal is a long-term goal. It's a training goal. It's a sustainability goal almost, where over time you want to embed some of these best practices into the instructor's workflow, try to almost change their behavior a little bit over time, so that next time around when they're preparing some new course content, we can actually make these things part of, or they can make those things part of their workflow rather than having to sort of revisit and fix after the fact. So that's really what we're trying to get to with the instructor feedback. One of the things that we think is very important is that we can do this very seamlessly within the context of the learning management system. And so that essentially means that feedback, that guidance is always there within the workflow that the instructor is already going through in order to create and add their content. And so that should dramatically help in terms of getting additional exposure, getting increased visibility. So just to show you what that looks like, I'm going back to the clickable prototype. Okay, so I'll sign in as the instructor again. Go into the course and into the folder that we were using. And so basically what we do with regards to the instructor feedback is very similar to what we do for the alternative accessible versions, in that every time that the original is available or can be accessed through the UI, and this is instructor only, we'll provide an indicator of how accessible that content item is. And then as an instructor, you can at any point in time engage with that. And so in this particular example, let's have a look at the PDF that we did first. And so we'll tell you how accessible that item is, sort of what the sort of main issue is, and then there'll be a ton of sort of documentation and content wrapped around this to help them understand how it can affect people, how it can affect all students, in fact, as some guidance on how they can make some of those fixes. So for example, there's some documentation there, there's some reasons as to why this is important and how it can affect students, and then there's some very detailed guidance that they can go through in order to turn their original into a tagged PDF. So for example, and then at the end of it, they can, in this particular example, they can upload a new version, at which point that will replace the original. We will sort of reevaluate it. We will rescore it. We might be able to provide some additional feedback, and then we also regenerate the alternative accessible versions. And in this case, we can actually give them some additional feedback. So that's one example. Let's have a look at the other example, which is an image that's missing an alternative description. And so again, sort of tell you how accessible the item is, what some of the issues are, how it affects students. There's some examples on how to write a good description, and so on. And then in this particular case, there's no need to upload a new version. You can actually just provide your fix directly into Ally, which will then make its way back, which will make its way back into the LMS. And so you can enter an alternative description, or you can indicate that the image is decorative. And then once doing that, you'll get an updated score, and we might be able to provide some additional feedback. So these are just two examples of quite a long list of different accessibility issues and guidance that we give around those accessibility issues. All right, moving back to the slide. So that's the second part of what Ally does. That's really about the providing that instructor feedback, providing that guidance, and trying to raise their awareness and increase that visibility a little bit more. The last part of what it does is, based on doing this across everything within your learning management system, including everything that was there before the Ally integration was enabled, we'll provide a feedback loop back to the institution, where we'll essentially generate a full institutional course content accessibility report, which will give you some very detailed sort of insight and understanding as to how you're doing from a course content accessibility point of view. So it'll tell you sort of how accessible your content is, how things are evolving over time, what the most problematic, sort of what the most common issues are, what the most problematic courses are, and so on. And so this is really aimed at trying to shed some light onto something that's currently quite hard to get by, and sort of raise that understanding a little bit as to how you're doing, where some of the problems are, and what you can potentially do yourself as an institution to help further improve things. And so let's have a look at that as well, and that's the last part of the demo. And so for this is an administrator feature. I'll sign in as an administrator, and I'll go into the administration space, and from there you can get to the accessibility, to the course content accessibility report. And so the report essentially allows you to look at things either by semester, by month, by academic year. And if you look at things by and then for each of those different time periods, you can then essentially drill down and get a sense of how many courses are involved, how many content items are involved, what is the distribution, how accessible is your content with and without Ally, what are the most common issues. We sort of divide things up into what's severe, what's major, what's minor. And then for each of those issues, you can then also click through and get a list of all of the courses that have that issue, and then get a list of all of the items within those courses that have that issue. So it really kind of allows you to go from the very high level, from the institutional overview, down into the individual course and in the individual content item level. And then there's a second view to this, which is the courses view, which essentially gives you a list of all of the courses at your institution. For each of those courses, you can then drill down and get an individual course content accessibility report, which will tell you how accessible the course is with and without Ally, how many items are in the course, what the distribution is, as well as what all of the issues are that were identified within the course. And then again, same thing for each of those issues. You can click through and get some additional information about the issue, and then get a list of all of the items within that course that have that particular issue. So this again gives you a way to go from the institutional level all the way down into the individual course and the individual content item level. So that's the institutional report at a very high level. I think we're doing well on time. So just to summarize, so basically Ally has three main feature areas. There's the alternative accessible versions, which we automatically generate, make available to the student and the instructor within the LMS, which tries to provide them with a more accessible starting point. Then there's the instructor feedback, where we will provide feedback to instructors on the accessibility of their content, as well as provide them with very detailed guidance on how they can fix some of those identified issues, all within the context of the LMS. And then there's the institutional report, which essentially allows them to get that institution-wide insight and that institution-wide overview as to how you're performing as an institution with regards to your course content. This is kind of the way in which I like to think about the problem. So we think of accessibility of course content very much as a spectrum or a continuum, and as an institution you sort of land at a certain point on that continuum, and for many institutions this is pretty far down, and essentially everything that Ally tries to do tries to move you up on the spectrum as much as possible. And so that's where, first of all, the automated accessible versions come in, which are automatically will automatically move you up on the spectrum quite a bit. And in order to help close that remaining gap, that's where you do need engagement from the instructor, from the institution. And so that's where, first of all, the instructor feedback comes in, which gives you a very automated way in which you can disseminate some of that training, some of that documentation, some of that help and guidance, which will help you move up a little bit more on that spectrum. And then the institutional report is essentially there to kind of oversee that entire process, give you a sense of where you are on the spectrum, and what else you can do to help further close down that gap. Things like organize specific training and who do I need to target for that training, things like licensing specific software, and so on. So that's kind of how all of those how all of the different Ally features work together to try and move you up on the spectrum as much as possible. So a few practical notes before we talk a little bit more about some of the user group engagements that will be kicking off. So a few practical things. So the current plan is to officially launch Ally for Blackboard Learn 9.1, Moodle Rooms, and Canvas in April of this year, and this will be for the North America, UK. For North America, UK, and Australia, New Zealand. And then in June, this would be followed in June by a Spanish release of Ally, which would be available to the sort of Latin America market, as well as Spain and so on. And then between September and December, we'd be doing a lot of internationalization work, making it available in a lot of additional languages, things like most of the sort of European language, Western European, Northern European languages, things like Portuguese for Brazil and Portugal, and so on. So we expect to see a lot of movement there. In terms of standalone Moodle, our current plan is to launch this in the second half of 2017 on the back of that Moodle Rooms integration. So we're working very hard on that. In terms of the Brightspace or D2L integration, we're still working on an exact timeline for that. We're working very actively with D2L on this, and so we hope to have a more final timeline very soon. In terms of, and this is mostly for some of the international people that are attending today, but so Ally is a cloud-hosted service. It's fully hosted within Amazon Web Services. When we do the official launch, so when Ally goes out of beta in April, it'll be hosted from 3 data centers. There will be the North Virginia one in the US, there will be the Frankfurt one in Germany, and the Sydney one in Australia. In September, we'll be adding 2 more to that, which will be Singapore and Sao Paulo in Brazil. If you have any, so there is a license fee associated to Ally. And that's kind of because we're processing a lot of additional content. We want to make sure that this is a sustainable initiative that gets the attention that it needs. If you have any questions about pricing, then feel free to just drop me an email, and I'd be happy to help you out with that. All right. So a few words about the user group. So this is kind of the this webinar is kind of the official kickoff of the user group, just to bring everyone sort of on the same page. There's the first 2 user group interactions are already being planned. The first one will be taking place at the end of January, early February, where we'll be doing some UX research on how Ally can integrate with either documentation that you already have at the institution, and or how, for example, how you think instructors should be able to reach out to the sort of department or resources that already exist at the institution when they have an issue with sort of fixing their content, or how a student should be able to reach out when they're having some difficulty with a particular alternative accessible format. So we'll be launching some UX research around that. This will probably be a fairly brief survey. And just to be very clear, your sort of participation in all of these different user group interactions is optional, so you can sort of pick and choose the ones that you want to participate in. But if you do participate, then you will have a very sort of direct influence on prioritization, on design work, and so on. So that one will be kicking off. We'll be sending out a message on the user group email list very soon about this. So that'll really be the first thing. Then at the end of February, we'll be running a set of usability tests for the instructor feedback flows. We're not entirely sure yet whether that'll be synchronous and sort of supervised, where we'll set up a few time slots that you can sign up for and then run through a test, or it might also be asynchronous and unsupervised, where we send out a package which sort of takes you through a particular flow and asks you to complete it. So we're still making up our mind on how exactly to do that, but these will definitely be the sort of first two things that we'll be organizing. Another thing that will be happening in the next few weeks is we'll be setting up a space for this user group, where and so this will be a space where we can provide updates, where we can share some details around some of these user interactions. But it'll also be a place where you can actually talk to each other. So we definitely want this to be a community rather than just us feeding information all the time. So it'll give you a place where you can talk to some of your peers around this, and maybe about accessibility in general. It'll also offer a place where you can provide suggestions, ideas for product features or things like that, and then you'll also be able to vote on other people's ideas, and that will actually directly feed into our prioritization, into our roadmap. Will actually be the main thing that we look at to determine our roadmap. So in terms of influencing the sort of future direction of Ally, that is definitely a very good way to participate and directly influence that. Okay, and I think that's all I had. So I'm sure Simon has been answering questions as I was going along. Are there any other questions? I think we still have a few minutes.
Can you repeat again how people can sign up for the user group?
So in order to sign up to the user group, hold on. So I think for most of you, you're already a member of the user group. If you filled out this particular form, then you will already be a member of the user group, and you'll be automatically added to the user group space. If you haven't filled out this form yet, then definitely do so, and then you'll be included in future communication, and will be added to the user group space as well. Any other questions before we sign off? Oh, yes, excellent question. I forgot to mention. So I did record this session. I'll be putting it on I'll be putting it on YouTube, and I'll be sending out the link in the next few days.
There was one more question about whether this would be available on the Blackboard community website. Do you know if that's there already?
So it is very likely that the user group will end up using the Blackboard community, the existing Blackboard community site as its sort of main space. We're doing some final evaluation right now, but it's very likely that that'll be it.
Okay.
Cool. And there's also a question about publisher content. So this is a good question. So basically, what Ally looks at today is all of the content that lives inside of the LMS. In the sort of native LMS tools. Going forward, we kind of want to extend that into any content that's being referenced from those native LMS tools. Things like LTI tools are a challenge because they're mostly black box for us. So if we want to incorporate some of the content that's inside of an LTI tool, we'd have to do sort of a custom integration for each of those LTI tools. So that's something that we can look at, but it's not something that would automatically work. In terms of publisher content itself, so it kind of depends how you're pulling it into your LMS, but we are having very active conversations with most of the big publishers. On Ally, they've actually shown a lot of interest in this as well. And so there might be something that happens on the publisher side, which will then feed through into how that publisher content is being surfaced within your LMS. And we'll sorry, and we'll it is very likely that we'll be doing some sort of survey around how you're using publisher content within your courses and how you ideally would like to see that integration work as a UX research, as sort of a quick survey at some point in the future as well. So, and then there's a question about will there be a test environment? So the goal is to so once we get to the point of officially launching all of the different integrations, is to have publicly available test environments for all of those different integrations. So that's something that we'll be working to set up. And then behind the Blackboard. So I'm actually not an expert myself on behind the Blackboard. My understanding is that this is the help and support system. So there will be, for people using Ally, there will be a section for Ally support specifically. In terms of the Ally user group, I believe that will be in the that will most likely be in the community system. So which I believe is a different system. But my knowledge might be letting me down here. All right, perfect. So it looks like that's all of the questions. Thanks very much for attending this. I'll send out the link to recording after this, and enjoy the rest of your day.